Bernard de Montreal. Book Beyond the Mind. Chapter 12. Parasites of the Mind. The mind is a relay that connects the physical, astral and mental dimensions beyond the thinking range of the lower intellectual register. It rechannels all of its unassimilated information through the dream state, an egoically disengaged function that processes unresolved conflicts until they have been integrated by the lower self. The intellect is only a facet of mind reality. Through conscious thought, the mind challenges the personality's illusions and has the ability to inform from vantage points that give comprehensive understanding and depth to life. The level of incoming data is raised beyond the conditioning of the physical senses, freeing the personality from the astral relationship it unconsciously maintains with spiritual guides or presences that condition thinking for reasons linked to their own experiential memory. The mind is globally advantageous only when experienced within the framework of a comprehensive, multidimensional reality. When thought vibrates above a subjective frequency, the new mental dimensions that are brought into perspective increase understanding. Interference with creative intelligence decreases and the karmic link with the astral plane is severed. The unconscious mind is a support, rather than a creative system, permeated by unstable psychic energy non-integrated within a universal circuit of pre-personal communication. It informs and disinforms, which accounts for the disordered nature of life and the endless need for experience. Disinformation results from the inability to instruct oneself from higher planes, whose function is to adjust thoughts from sources beyond the astral or death world. The limitations of the unconscious mind come from its astral coloration through the programmed life plan of the soul. Astral consciousness is experiential and unbalanced. It requires constant adjustment. Were the mind fed from the supramental spheres, it would exert its cosmic privilege. Its creative undertakings would harmonize the life process through perceptions, thus would ensure equilibrium of the life forces. We do not understand the cosmic nature of the mind. We have no conscious rapport with it except through the subjective thought process. We are constantly seeking, through a fictitious identity, what corresponds to our subjective nature because of the partiality of our being. The mind is a universal circuit of communication that stretches beyond the boundaries of the personality. It appears otherwise because of our involvement with its lower psychological function rather than its psychic dimension. This fundamental flaw is the cause behind planetary ignorance, and the involutionary difficulty in acceding to self-identity. consciousness follows the realization that the mind is not simply a lower self-operation but an information channel that moves energy from higher to lower dimensional levels. Man is not conscious, he is energy conditioned from astral levels and thrust into experiences from which he suffers so that the soul may evolve through the wrenching of his subjective attitudes. The latter are part of his astral consciousness. Through them he seeks in vain to grasp the nature of reality, while this limiting experience bars access to the full dimension of the thought experience. Subjective attitudes are soul forces that give rise to negative feelings which can easily boycott mental freedom, unless they are brought into the light of the creative dimension of the mind. They use the feeling center through the blind spots of the personality to create a psychic bond with the astral plane. We seek by way of subjective emotions a false and temporary grasp on life which pushes us into astral experience. Such a life is not real. It forestalls the development of a nexus between the double, the soul, and the ego, the potentially intelligent terminal of cosmic energy that must be integrated before conscious entry into a life stream where leaving behind the physical envelope no longer necessitates returning to the astral death plane. The intelligent understanding of attitudes is fundamental. If an integrated knowledge of self is to make up the inner components of consciousness. The emotional energy used in subjective feeling raised by attitudes carries with it a vibrational register that strongly entangles the individual in distorted values that reveal the weaker aspects of the lower self. This is due to the fact that the higher mental being has not sufficiently taken root within the self. Attitudes block the high mental presence and prevent access to the dimension of self-reality. They replace reality with perceptions that are emotionally charged and conditioned. We do not experience freedom of the mind. Parasitic elements tamper with mind energy as they move through astral consciousness. We are usually unaware of mind parasites unless we have been versed in psychic sciences and related experiences. Parasites affect the mind and feed on its energy from a variety of sources. Some are very low psychic matter, while others are more subtle. They belong to the psychic world and are retarding factors in the evolution towards self-identity. The parasitic elements that constitute subjective consciousness infringe on the quality and evolution of intelligence. They are responsible for its gradual deterioration throughout life and the disequilibrium of the life forces. We fail to see the mind as a psychic territory constantly invaded by forces from other planes. We have secured ourselves fictitiously within the boundaries of an intellectual persuasion as to the nature of consciousness. Only when mental disease or breakdown appears are we tempted to explore the possibility that distorted communication from the spirit world might be the cause behind this affliction. Someone on the brink of a mental collapse would be much closer to the understanding of parasitic conditioning were such psychic facts known or available. Clarity of mind is diminished by astral parasites. Intruders in the field of consciousness. They diminish the light that emanates from the mental plane by their unsought and unknown presence. Their energy emanates from entities that feed on the mind through our slavery to lower emotions and their attendant thoughts. They interfere with and distort self-reality. They weaken the natural creative psychic functions and deform the personality through the infusion of thought vibrations that divide the lower and higher self. Self-cognition is based on the intuitive relationship between the higher and the lower self. When this relationship is jeopardized by astral parasites, the mind loses its light and is eventually magnetized by non-intelligent thoughts that paralyze the psyche and keep the ego from an adequate perception of its reality. The psyche is the opening of the mind to an infinite path of inner communication. As the mind grows in awareness, the ego adjusts to its new inner territory and begins to understand the complex manipulation to which it has been subjected since the beginning of its development. As consciousness matures and loses its parasitic elements, the psyche takes on a new configuration, allowing the ego to communicate with planes that were existent before its present incarnation, and which have always been part of the self-reality entrusted to the soul as the undying principle of energy that characterizes human consciousness. But the psyche is also a territory which can be invaded by elements that do not belong to human consciousness. Such intrusion into the mind is the cause behind psychological suffering and lack of identity, the result, the growth process of the lower mind rather than an alliance with the higher principle that underlies its psychic activity. Consciousness evolves with the mind. But the soul evolves only when the mind has been freed from the factors that paralyze intelligence and force upon the ego a state of consciousness unbefitting of its potential reality. Mind parasites are part of the psychic nature of the death or astral world. They are whole or parts of psychic entities that feed on egoic emotions and thoughts in order to fulfill their own evolutionary development. Very little is known in the astral world about the cosmic dimension of consciousness. The astral world is basically an archive, a vast memory bank that serves the soul's spiritual needs. But the mind goes far beyond the astral plane. It is an infinite process that starts at the astral level and stretches beyond until it reaches the highest planes of mental energy from which the human form was derived before its descent into physical matter. Until the ego has taken notice of its thought process to realize that interferences occur which are responsible for much of its non-creative experience. The soul remains the main force behind its actions, and the double or source of its conscious energy is unable to change creatively the unnecessary ignorance in its evolution. The soul has great power over the unconscious ego. For the self to understand the nature of the mind, it must begin to understand that thoughts do not originate in the brain, and that this part of the physical being is but the terminal of its consciousness. Such realization is shattering for the self, inexperienced in interdimensional communication. Once this barrier has been overcome, it becomes evident that the mind is highly subjected to interference, and that parasitic elements are constantly trying to obstruct its sight. The evolution of consciousness will bring the individual in contact with knowledge that defies science fiction, freeing man from all notions that have been entertained through the ages. It will propulse him on a path leading to a communication that will increase inner knowledge and diminish reliance on intellectual belief systems in his search for personal identity. Conscious communication with astral entities will eventually confirm that little is to be learned from them, and that the energy source of the higher mind is in itself an infinite recourse to the understanding of the science of life throughout the universe. Not until the mind has been set free from astral parasites will it be possible to undertake an objective study of the parallel universes. The mind's energy, no longer absorbed by the astral field of thought, becomes a perfect channel for supramental intelligences that collaborate with the development of intelligent creativity within the lower parameters of mind reality. Parallel universes are to the mind what the physical universe is to the body. The sciences that need to be developed to understand this cannot be astrally manipulated. The intellect is an astral function of the lower mind based on the collective power of the ego, whereas its mental function resides in its coupling with the etheric self, unconditioned by the need to relate psychologically. The astral function of the mind creates a psychic barrier which prevents systemic intelligence from coming into official contact with mankind. This condition is eliminated once the Earth's etheric forces have generated sufficient energy to protect its etheric envelope from astral parasites. Contact with outer civilizations will then be officially established, and Earth sciences will be able to be aligned with systemic sciences under the guidance of a planetary regency. Mind parasites are the most important single elements that retard the evolution of the human race. They correspond to a form of fallout from the astral plane. Earth sciences today are the embodiment of the astral conquest of the human mental sphere. It takes full consciousness to understand the relationship that exists between death and the physical experience. The intellectual self still remains a virtual reality perceived and measured through astral consciousness, the very matter that gives substance to egocentricity. Under these circumstances, the individual is limited to experience life on the basis of a freedom of will that fails to correspond to the freedom of the mind. Freedom of the mind cannot be achieved until the self has taken over the ambivalence of his own thoughts. That is, until he has learned how the thinking process really works above and beyond its astral attributes. The intellectual naivety of the unconscious ego represents the astral influence over the mind, and calls for a readjustment of its psychic energy in order to increase the psychic rapport with the parallel dimensions that evolve beyond death. Mind parasites deviate the light or the energy of intelligence that pulses in from the center of the systemic universe for the evolutionary benefit of sentient beings. The dead play a major parasitic role because of the insufficiency of their light, and the cosmic restriction under which they evolve with respect to knowledge born of the fusion of the thought adjuster and the soul via the conscious ego. They fail to realize the vital aspects of supramental evolution. Many levels and sources of parasitic disinformation exist in the universe. Those forces have easy access to human unconsciousness when assisted by man's lower emotions, the closest form of terminal energy they can relate to as they actualize their unseen influence from the astral dimension. Systemic intelligences are usually free of such low astral interferences, which explains their advanced stage of intelligence evolution. But many of those races use the Earth's astral field to their own scientific advantage. For this reason, no civilization evolving beyond the Earth's atmosphere is allowed to come into open, official contact with mankind until a supraconscious regulatory body or planetary regency will have been set up on the Earth's etheric plane. Any contact with systemic civilizations at the physical level will remain unofficial until sufficient occult knowledge has been released to accelerate and ensure an alignment of the astral relationship with mankind, with disincarnated entities sufficiently advanced to understand that the urgency of the known evolution is dependent on that of humanity. The mind is a multi-dimensional continuum whose connection to the physical brain through the astral body makes the physical experience possible, while its connection through the mental body brings intelligence within the reach of human consciousness. The mind cannot be expounded upon simply through the narrow investigation of a materialistic philosophy of science. It must be studied through the psychic stream of higher mental communication. The evolution of consciousness depends on the degree of assimilation and integration of knowledge, transmitted via the brain to consciousness from dimensions that lie beyond the physical plane, and as free as possible from astral parasites. The new man is conscious and free of karmic soul experience. He is connected psychically to mental sources, no longer the slave of a subjective thought process conditioned by the social dynamics of the collective mind, which retains the involutionary, retarding, racial memory. Religions have created belief systems that correspond to and promote the naivety and ignorance of the human race. They have spiritualized the reality of parallel dimensions into such a fable that intelligent telepathic contact with the spheres has been completely astralized. Prayer became a subjective and pious form of domination, inviting the individual into astral communion with the dead, instead of raising his telepathic faculty to communicate intelligently with higher mental worlds. Gradually, we have lost touch with reality as well as the ability to develop an objective understanding of the politics and importance of the invisible universe. Religions have perpetuated the myths of the spheres. Consciousness has become so astralized that intelligent contact with evolving forces throughout the universe has been lost, resulting in the endless search for personal identity. The different time frames which separate the worlds and their cultures were never made part of an integral universal reality, except through the limited efforts of an esoteric subculture that became, through the centuries, increasingly astralized but nevertheless remained a constant thorn in the side of the Church. Mind parasites can push the unconscious ego to obsessive actions or exert over it a restraining power that holds it back within a form of inertia it finds difficult to overcome. They are present in one form or another in unconscious life as part of the soul forces that the ego learns to overcome throughout its evolutionary experience. Whether we perceive mind parasites as entities, or thought forms, or just negative psychology, makes little difference in the short run. In the long run of evolutionary development, the difference must be taken seriously, since it allows the ego to dig into the mysteries of consciousness to isolate the elements that inflict upon it karmic suffering. If we consider the parasitic elements as entities, it is easier to deal with them in a more objective manner. If we choose to relate to them as thought forms, we lack the intellectual courage and advantage of releasing the necessary inner resources against them in order to neutralize their influences and put an end to their nefarious presence. Words carry the meaning we choose to give them. According to the degree of objectivity we can muster towards the transcendent aspect of psychic reality, We radiate more or less light. Not any man can deal with the idea of entities possibly infecting his mind. His chances in dealing objectively with parasitic reality are increased. However, to the extent of his capacity to perceive psychic reality as part of a multidimensional one. The difficulties we encounter when dealing with psychopathic illness wherein voices are heard and commands imposed on the feeble mind of an unbalanced ego, gives some clues as to the power of mind parasites that defy the human order by imposing their own astral brand of confusion on the mind of a naive humanity. We accept easily enough the historical fact or legend that prophets may have been in contact with other worlds or dimensions, but dismiss, for obvious reasons, the fact that millions upon millions of human beings are in contact with parallel dimensions whose denizens or entities may not be of the same order as those that came in contact with the great religious or mystical figures that gave birth to the religions of the world. In doing so, we maintain naively that the only beings that can come in contact with man are of the lofty kind, while the others do not. This ostrich outlook may be the reason why mental illnesses still remain the most elusive forms of sickness experienced by man. Turning down the volume of the mentally ill patient's radio through drugs does not eliminate the waves that pulse within it. Mental health practitioners will eventually have to admit that the brain is but a radio receiver, and that the waves that pulse through it come from the multidimensional reality of a universe that is supramaterial.